My name is Margaret Thompson, though everyone used to call me Maggie. I'm 72 years old, and as I sit here today, sometimes I marvel that I'm still alive to tell you what happened to me. It wasn't old age that caught me by surprise, nor the wrinkles that now map my face like rivers, nor the silver hair that replaced my once auburn curls. No, it was the unexpected path that led me to the streets of Denver, Colorado, that left me speechless. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine I would end my days sitting on the cold concrete of a sidewalk, invisible to those who passed by, reduced to nothing more than a shadow among the city's forgotten. I had occupied other roles in my life. I had been the daughter who helped her mother in the kitchen of our small house on Maple Street, the woman who rose early to face each workday at the textile factory, the wife who shared meals with a loving husband, the mother who baked fresh bread with tender care for her children. If you believe that miracles still happen, or if you've ever experienced something that deeply touched your faith, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking this journey of faith together. But one day, all of that crumbled like sand between my fingers, leaving behind only the silence of accumulated losses. The house on Maple Street, the one where Robert and I had raised our 2 children, where Sarah took her first steps, and where Tommy learned to ride his bicycle, was foreclosed after Robert's medical bills consumed our savings. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer doesn't negotiate payment plans, and Medicare only covers so much when you're fighting for your life. Robert died on a Tuesday in March, and with him went the anchor that had kept me steady for 43 years of marriage. Sarah lived in Seattle with her own family, struggling to make ends meet after her divorce, and Tommy had been deployed to Afghanistan for the 3rd time. They both tried to help, but life had already stretched their resources thin. Pride, that stubborn companion of a lifetime, prevented me from asking for more than they could reasonably give. The apartment I found after selling what little remained of our belongings was a cramped studio in downtown Denver, near the old railroad tracks. The walls were thin, stained with decades of previous tenants' stories, and the radiator made sounds like a dying animal throughout the winter nights. But it was mine, and for 8 months, I managed to keep it that way with my Social Security checks and a part-time job cleaning offices in the early morning hours. My hands, once soft from years of applying hand cream after doing dishes, became rough and cracked from industrial cleaning supplies. The janitorial work wasn't glamorous, but it gave me purpose and just enough income to survive. I would arrive at the downtown office building at 4 in the morning when the city was still asleep and the streets belonged to street sweepers and insomniacs. The silence of those empty offices became my companion, along with the rhythmic sound of my mop against the linoleum floors. I remember the morning everything changed. It was a Thursday in November, and the first snow of the season was beginning to dust the sidewalks. I had been feeling dizzy for several days, dismissing it as fatigue from working too many hours. But as I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor of the Meridian building, carrying my bucket of cleaning supplies, my vision blurred and my knees buckled beneath me. The fall down those concrete stairs felt endless. I remember the sound of the bucket clattering, the chemical smell of spilled cleaning solution, and then nothing. When I woke up in Presbyterian St. Joseph's Hospital 3 days later, a kind nurse named Janet explained that I had suffered a concussion and broken my left wrist. But worse than the physical injuries was the news that followed. I had been fired from my cleaning job for abandoning my post, and my landlord had already begun eviction proceedings for missed rent. "Is there someone we can call?" Janet asked gently, her brown eyes filled with the kind of compassion that medical professionals learn to balance with practical necessity. I gave her Sarah's number, but when my daughter answered, her voice carried the weight of her own struggles. Between her own rent, her children's school expenses, and the aftermath of her divorce, she couldn't help with security deposits or first month's rent for a new place. The hospital's social worker, Mrs. Patricia Davidson, was a professional with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and glasses that made her look perpetually concerned. She presented me with options: a waiting list for subsidized housing that was 3 months long, temporary shelters that were already overcrowded, and various social services that required paperwork I didn't understand and appointments I couldn't make without an address. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, reviewing the forms on her clipboard, "at your age, with your medical history and current financial situation, your best option might be the Riverside Mission. It's not permanent, but it's safe and clean, and they serve 3 meals a day. But when she called the mission, they were at capacity, with a waiting list as long as the one for housing. Winter in Denver is unforgiving, and the city's resources for the homeless are stretched thin when the temperature drops below freezing. I spent my last night in the hospital knowing that the next day I would be discharged with nowhere to go, carrying my few belongings in a plastic hospital bag. The morning of my discharge arrived with an ice-cold wind that rattled the hospital windows. Janet helped me into the clothes I had been wearing the day of my accident: a blue cardigan with small buttons that Sarah had given me for Christmas, a pair of dark slacks, and comfortable walking shoes that had seen better days. My broken wrist was encased in a cast that made simple tasks like buttoning my sweater nearly impossible. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Thompson," Janet said, squeezing my good hand as I prepared to leave. "There are resources out there. Don't give up." But as I walked through the automatic doors of the hospital and felt the November wind cut through my thin cardigan, I realized I was about to enter a world I had only seen from a distance. The world of those who sleep in doorways and warm themselves over grates. The invisible people I had walked past countless times without truly seeing. The reality of homelessness hit me before I had even walked 2 blocks from the hospital. The weight of my situation settled in my chest like a stone as I stood on the corner of 17th and California, watching business people hurry past in their warm coats, their faces focused on destinations I no longer had. The plastic bag containing my few possessions, a change of underwear, my reading glasses, Robert's wedding ring that I kept on a chain around my neck, and a small Bible my mother had given me, felt heavier with each step. The first place I tried was the Salvation Army on Lawrence Street. A kind volunteer named Michael, probably in his 30s with prematurely gray hair, explained that they were full until at least the end of the month. "But you can come back each morning at 7, he said, handing me a cup of coffee that warmed my hands. "Sometimes people don't show up, and we have space." The coffee was bitter and weak, but it was hot, and I held that paper cup like it was made of gold. As I sat on their front steps, sipping the coffee and watching the morning traffic build, I tried to form a plan. Sarah had said she would wire me $50 as soon as her paycheck cleared, but that wouldn't be until Friday, 3 days away. I had $11.37 in my purse, enough for maybe 2 meals if I was careful. The public library on 13th Avenue became my refuge that first day. I spent hours in the periodical section, reading newspapers and magazines, pretending to be a regular patron rather than someone with nowhere to go. The librarian, a young woman with kind eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses, never asked me to leave, even when I dozed off in my chair during the afternoon. But libraries close at 9 o'clock, and suddenly I found myself back on the street as the city lights began to flicker on. The temperature had dropped significantly since morning, and my breath formed small clouds in the air. I walked aimlessly for what felt like hours, passing restaurants whose warm light and the smell of food made my empty stomach clench with longing. I eventually found myself in Curtis Park, a small green space that during the day was filled with office workers eating lunch and children playing on swings. But at night, it transformed into something different, a gathering place for others like me, people carrying their lives in backpacks and shopping carts, people who had learned to make beds out of park benches and roofs out of open sky. There was a woman about my age sitting on a bench near the old oak tree in the center of the park. Her gray hair was braided down her back, and she wore layers of sweaters beneath a coat that had seen better years. When she saw me standing there, uncertain and afraid, she patted the bench beside her. "First night?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight southern accent. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "I'm Dorothy," she said. "Dorothy Williams. Been out here about 2 years now. Lost my apartment when they raised the rent, and my disability check couldn't keep up." "Margaret Thompson," I replied. "Maggie." Dorothy showed me the unspoken rules of park survival, which corners were warmest, where the security guard made his rounds, and how to sleep sitting up to avoid drawing attention. She shared a blanket that smelled of city rain and old cigarettes, and together we watched the Denver skyline glitter in the distance. "The first night is the hardest," she told me, as we settled in for what would be the longest night of my life. "But you learn to adapt. Humans always do." But adaptation felt impossible as the temperature continued to drop. The park bench was unforgiving against my spine, and every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant siren, the footsteps of late-night pedestrians, made me start with fear. My broken wrist throbbed in its cast, and I couldn't find a position that didn't send sharp pains up my arm. Dorothy fell asleep around midnight, her breathing deep and regular beside me. But sleep eluded me completely. I found myself staring up at the stars, barely visible through the city's light pollution, thinking about the warm bed I had shared with Robert for so many years, about the safety of locked doors and familiar walls. Around 3 a.m, a police officer made his rounds through the park. His flashlight beam swept across the benches, and when it found Dorothy and me, he approached with measured steps. Officer Martinez, according to his name tag ad, was younger than my son Tommy, with a mustache and tired eyes that suggested this wasn't his first encounter with homeless women in the park. "Ladies, I'm going to have to ask you to move along," he said, his voice neither cruel nor kind, just tired. "City ordinance prohibits sleeping in the park after midnight." Dorothy was used to this routine. She gathered her blanket with practiced efficiency and helped me to my feet. "Come on, Maggie," she said. "We'll find somewhere else." We spent the rest of the night walking. Dorothy knew the route, past the all-night laundromat where we could sit for an hour before the owner asked us to leave, past the 24-hour McDonald's where we bought a cup of coffee to justify our presence, past the bus station where security was less vigilant about people sitting in the waiting area. By dawn, my feet ached in my walking shoes, and exhaustion had settled into my bones like an old friend. But I had survived my first night on the streets of Denver, and there was something almost triumphant about watching the sun rise over the city I now called home in a way I had never imagined. The morning brought new challenges and small mercies. The Riverside Mission served breakfast to anyone who showed up before 8 o'clock, no questions asked. I stood in line with dozens of others, men and women of all ages, each carrying their own story of how they had arrived at this place. The oatmeal was thick and warm, the coffee strong, and for 30 minutes I sat at a long table surrounded by the quiet conversation of people grateful for a hot meal. It was at that breakfast table that I began to understand something fundamental about life on the streets. Dignity doesn't disappear just because you don't have an address. The man sitting across from me, a veteran named James with gray hair and calloused hands, spoke eloquently about philosophy and history. The woman beside me, Maria, had a master's degree in social work, but had been living in her car for 6 months after a series of medical emergencies bankrupted her. These were not the stereotypes I had carried about homeless people. These were educated, articulate human beings who had been pushed to the margins by circumstances beyond their control. Medical bills, job losses, mental health crises, family tragedies. Looking around that table, I realized I was no longer observing homelessness from the outside. I had become part of this invisible community. The second day brought a harsh lesson in the mathematics of survival. $11.37 sounds like a small fortune when you're counting in coffee cups and day-old donuts, but it disappears with frightening speed when you're measuring your life in basic necessities. A cup of coffee cost $2, a gas station sandwich nearly $5, and the laundromat where I could wash my face and comb my hair in the restroom required quarters that multiplied my expenses in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had become an expert at rationing, something I hadn't done since the lean years when Robert and I were first married, and stretching every paycheck to cover rent and groceries. But this was different. This was rationing without the promise of next week's paycheck, without the safety net of family dinners on Sunday, without the comfort of knowing the hardship was temporary. Dorothy had warned me about the physical toll that sleeping rough would take on my body, but I hadn't truly understood until that second morning when I woke up on a bench behind the Greyhound station with my neck twisted at an impossible angle and my hip joint screaming in protest. The cast on my wrist had begun to smell, a damp, unpleasant odor that spoke of hygiene problems I couldn't solve without access to a proper bathroom. The public restrooms in downtown Denver varied dramatically in their hospitality to people like me. Some had attendants who looked the other way when I spent 10 minutes trying to clean myself with paper towels and cold water. Others had security cameras and time limits that made basic human needs feel like criminal acts. I learned which McDonald's had the cleanest facilities, which library branches were most tolerant of extended visits, and which churches left their doors unlocked during the day. St. Anthony's Catholic Church on Bannock Street became a sanctuary of sorts, not because they offered services specifically for homeless people, they didn't, but because Father Rodriguez, a man in his 60s with silver hair and gentle eyes, never asked me to leave when I slipped into a back pew during the quiet afternoon hours. The church was old, with stained glass windows that cast jeweled light across wooden pews worn smooth by decades of prayers. I would sit in that colored light, feeling the warmth of the building seep into my cold bones, and try to remember how to pray. It had been years since I had attended church regularly. Robert and I had been Easter and Christmas Catholics for the last decade of our marriage, people who believed but didn't practice, who found God in private moments rather than public worship. But sitting in that pew, with nowhere else to go and no one else to turn to, I found myself speaking to God with an honesty I hadn't managed in years. I don't know how this happened. I whispered to the crucifix hanging above the altar. I worked my whole life. I paid my taxes, raised my children, took care of Robert when he was dying. How did I end up here? The response was silence, but it wasn't empty silence. It was the kind of quiet that holds space for questions without demanding immediate answers, the kind of peace that churches have specialized in for centuries. I would doze in that pew sometimes, my head resting against the smooth wood. And for brief moments, I could pretend I was just an ordinary parishioner taking a moment for contemplation. But church is close too, and evening always came with its harsh reminder that I had nowhere to go. The second night was worse than the first, because now I knew what to expect. The cold that seeped through every layer of clothing, the sounds of the city that seemed amplified in the darkness, the way my mind would race despite my body's exhaustion. Dorothy and I had developed a routine. We would meet at Curtis Park around sunset, share whatever food we had managed to gather during the day, and then begin the night's migration from one temporary shelter to another. She had been teaching me the geography of homelessness, which doorways provided the most protection from wind, which businesses had the warmest external walls, which neighborhoods had security guards who were more interested in keeping peace than enforcing property laws. The trick, she told me as we shared a bag of stale donuts someone had given her outside a coffee shop, is to stay invisible during the day and find safety in numbers at night. Alone, you're a target. Together, you're just part of the scenery. But invisibility came with its own psychological cost. I began to notice how people's eyes would slide past me on the street, how conversations would lower when I approached, how my very presence seemed to make others uncomfortable. I was becoming a ghost in my own city, a shadow that people stepped around without acknowledgement. The third day brought rain, a cold, persistent drizzle that turned the streets slick and made finding shelter urgent rather than merely preferable. My cardigan, which had seemed adequate for autumn weather, became sodden and heavy, clinging to my skin like a wet shroud. The cast on my wrist began to soften at the edges, and I worried about infection in the breaks of my skin that never seemed to fully dry. I spent most of that day in the downtown library, but even there I felt the weight of other people's judgment. A security guard kept walking past my table, and I overheard two library patrons complaining to a librarian about that homeless woman who smells in the periodical section. The shame burned hotter than the cold, and I found myself leaving earlier than necessary, preferring the honest discomfort of the rain to the veiled hostility of indoor spaces. That afternoon, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. I walked to the dumpster behind a sandwich shop on 16th Street and looked inside for food. The bags were tied neatly, and I could see that most of the discarded items were day-old bread and sandwiches that had passed their sell-by date, but were still perfectly edible. Standing there in the rain, reaching into that dumpster with my good hand, I felt something inside me break. This wasn't about pride anymore, or dignity, or maintaining the illusion that my situation was temporary. This was about survival in its most basic form. The sandwich I retrieved was turkey and Swiss on whole wheat, wrapped in clear plastic, and it tasted like salvation despite the circumstances of its acquisition. I ate standing in that alley, rain dripping from my hair, and for the first time since leaving the hospital, I cried. Not the dignified tears of grief or loss, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone who had reached the absolute bottom of their circumstances. I cried for the woman I used to be, for the life I had lost, for the future that seemed to stretch ahead without hope or purpose. But even at that lowest moment, something inside me refused to surrender completely. Maybe it was stubbornness inherited from my Irish grandmother, or maybe it was the memory of Robert's voice during his final weeks. reminding me that I was stronger than I knew. Whatever it was, it kept me moving, kept me looking for the next meal, the next safe place to sleep, the next day to survive. The rain continued through the night, making our usual outdoor shelters impossible. Dorothy and I spent those dark hours walking, ducking into 24-hour establishments when we could, warming ourselves over subway grates when we couldn't. By morning, we were both exhausted, soaked through, and beginning to show the physical signs of malnutrition that come with irregular meals and constant stress. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked Dorothy as we waited outside the mission for breakfast to be served. 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days, she replied without hesitation. But who's counting? The precision of her answer frightened me more than anything else she could have said. It spoke of permanent adaptation, of resignation, of a life measured in survived days rather than lived experiences. Standing in that line of hungry people, smelling of rain and dumpster food, I realized I was in danger of becoming a statistic myself. Another elderly woman who had fallen through the cracks of a system that talked about safety nets but practiced selective compassion. The 4th day of my life on the streets began differently than the others. Dorothy wasn't at our usual meeting spot in Curtis Park, and after waiting for over an hour, I began to worry. The homeless community in Denver was small enough that people kept track of each other, and unexpected absences usually meant trouble, illness, arrest, or worse. I spent the morning looking for her, checking the mission, the library, the shelters where she sometimes stayed. Finally, a man named Carlos who frequented the same soup kitchen told me that Dorothy had been taken to the hospital during the night. "Pneumonia," he said, shaking his head. "It's going around. You better be careful." The news hit me harder than I expected. In just 3 days, Dorothy had become more than a companion. She had been my guide, my teacher, my proof that it was possible to survive this life. Without her, I felt exposed and vulnerable in ways I hadn't anticipated. The city suddenly seemed larger, more hostile, full of dangers I didn't know how to navigate alone. But there was no time for self-pity. The $50 Sarah had promised hadn't arrived. Bank transfers can be delayed, and Friday had come and gone without the expected relief. My remaining money had dwindled to less than $3, not enough for even the cheapest meal. For the first time since leaving the hospital, I would go to bed hungry. Hunger is a patient teacher. It starts as a gentle reminder, a slight hollowness that can be ignored or dismissed. But as hours pass without food, it becomes more insistent, more demanding of attention. By evening, my stomach was cramping, and I found myself thinking about food with an obsession I had never experienced. Not just wanting to eat, but needing to, craving it with every fiber of my being. I tried to sleep on a bench outside the Paramount Theater, but hunger makes rest impossible. I would doze for a few minutes, then wake with dreams of the kitchen in my old house, the smell of pot roast in the slow cooker, the sight of fresh bread cooling on the counter. These weren't memories anymore. They were hallucinations, vivid and taunting. The second day without food brought a different kind of exhaustion. My body, already weakened by poor sleep and stress, began to slow down in ways that frightened me. Simple tasks like walking to the library required conscious effort, and climbing the steps to the front door left me dizzy and short of breath. The librarian, the kind one with the glasses, looked at me with concern when I nearly stumbled at the information desk. "Ma'am, are you all right?" she asked, reaching out to steady me. "Just tired," I lied, because admitting the truth felt like admitting defeat. She brought me a cup of water and suggested I rest in the quiet reading room. "Take your time," she said. "Stay as long as you need." That afternoon, something happened that shattered what remained of my dignity. I was sitting outside a Starbucks, watching people come and go with their expensive coffee drinks and pastries, when a woman about my daughter's age approached me. She was well-dressed, carrying a designer purse, her hair perfectly styled. "Excuse me," she said, looking uncomfortable. "I saw you sitting here, and I thought maybe you could use this." She handed me a $5 bill, quickly, as if my poverty might be contagious. The money represented a meal, maybe 2 if I was careful, but taking it meant accepting a new identity. I was no longer Margaret Thompson, retired textile worker and widow. I was that homeless woman people gave charity to on the street. The transformation was complete and irreversible. "Thank you," I whispered, because gratitude was still possible even in humiliation. But as she hurried away, I heard her on her phone. Yes, I gave her some money, she was saying to whoever had answered. It made me feel so much better about myself. You know how guilty I feel driving past them every day. I sat there holding that $5 bill, understanding that I had become someone's good deed for the day, a way for comfortable people to feel better about their comfortable lives. The money would buy food, and I needed food, but the cost to my sense of self felt almost unbearable. By the third day without a proper meal, my body was beginning to shut down in subtle but alarming ways. My vision would blur without warning, and I had to grip handrails carefully when navigating stairs. The cast on my wrist itched constantly, and I suspected it was hiding an infection that I couldn't afford to treat. Most troubling of all, I was beginning to have trouble concentrating, trouble remembering simple things like what day it was or where I had left my few possessions. I used the $5 for a McDonald's hamburger and small coffee, eating slowly to make it last, trying to calm my rebellious stomach that wanted to reject the sudden influx of food after days of emptiness. The restaurant was busy with the lunch crowd, business people grabbing quick meals, families with children, teenagers laughing over shared French fries. I sat in a corner booth, trying to be invisible, trying not to smell too obviously homeless. But food doesn't solve the deeper problem of having nowhere to go, no one to call, no resources to draw upon. As I sat in that McDonald's, watching normal people live normal lives, I began to understand something fundamental about despair. It's not dramatic or sudden. It's a gradual erosion of hope, a slow recognition that the problems facing you are bigger than your ability to solve them. That night, I found myself back in Curtis Park, alone on the bench where Dorothy and I had spent our first night together. The autumn air was growing colder, promising the harsh winter ahead, and I pulled my thin cardigan tighter around my shoulders. My stomach ached with emptiness again. One small meal hadn't been enough to restore 3 days of misnutrition, and I could feel my energy ebbing like a tide going out. For the first time since this ordeal began, I allowed myself to consider what the social worker had delicately called end-of-life planning. How long could a 72-year-old woman survive on the streets? What happened to people like me when winter came to Denver, when the temperature dropped below zero and staying warm became a matter of life and death? I thought about Robert's final weeks in the hospital. How peaceful he had looked when the pain medication finally took hold, how he had squeezed my hand and whispered that he wasn't afraid anymore. Death, when it comes naturally, surrounded by love and medical care, can have dignity. But death on the streets, from exposure, from illness, from the thousand small violences that poverty inflicts, had no such grace. As I sat there in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of a city that had forgotten me, I felt something I had never experienced before. The complete absence of hope. Not sadness, not anger, not even fear. Just a vast emptiness where hope used to live. I closed my eyes and tried to pray, but even God seemed unreachably far away. The park grew quiet except for the whisper of wind through the old oak tree. Streetlights cast long shadows across the empty pathways. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear the lonely sound of a train horn echoing through the Denver night. I pulled my knees up to my chest, wrapped my arms around them as best I could with my broken wrist, and prepared to face what I believed might be my final night. But in that moment of absolute surrender, when I had nothing left to lose and no strength left to fight, something extraordinary was about to happen, something that would change not just that night, but everything that came after. The third night without proper food brought a kind of clarity I had never experienced. The sharp-edged awareness that comes when the body begins to surrender its non-essential functions to preserve life itself. I could feel my heart beating irregularly, a flutter and skip that spoke of stress and malnutrition. My hands shook even when I wasn't cold, and the edges of my vision seemed to pulse with a darkness that had nothing to do with the night around me. I had given up trying to sleep. Instead, I sat on that park bench like a sentry guarding nothing, watching the occasional car drift down 16th Avenue, their headlights sweeping across the empty park before disappearing into the distance. The city felt abandoned at 3 a.m, as if everyone else had fled to some safer place, leaving only the ghosts and the lost behind. The hunger had evolved beyond physical discomfort into something almost spiritual. a hollow ache that seemed to encompass not just my empty stomach, but my empty life, my empty future, the empty space where hope used to live. I found myself thinking about meals I had prepared for my family over the decades, Christmas dinners with golden turkey and sweet potato casserole, summer barbecues with corn on the cob dripping with butter, simple Tuesday night suppers of meatloaf and mashed potatoes that now seemed like feasts fit for royalty. But these memories brought no comfort, only a sharper awareness of what I had lost. Food, I was learning, wasn't just fuel for the body, it was connection, celebration, love made tangible. The act of sharing meals had been the rhythm of my life for 72 years, and now I was discovering what existed in the spaces between those beats. Silence and emptiness, and the terrible freedom of having nothing left to lose. Around 4 a.m, a police cruiser made its slow patrol through the park. Officer Martinez again, working the night shift, his flashlight beam sweeping across the benches with practiced efficiency. When the light found me, he stopped the car and got out, approaching with the weary caution of someone who had learned that homeless people could be unpredictable, dangerous, or tragic in equal measure. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentler than it had been the first night. "You can't sleep here, city ordinance." I looked up at him, this young man with his crisp uniform and his duty to enforce rules that made no accommodation for people who had nowhere else to go, and I felt something crack inside my chest. Not anger, not resentment, just a profound sadness for all of us trapped in systems that demanded compliance without offering alternatives. "I'm not sleeping," I said, and it was true. Sleep required a kind of peace I no longer possessed. He studied my face in the beam of his flashlight, and I saw him register the changes that 3 days without food had carved into my features. The hollowed cheeks, the darkened eyes, the grayish pallor of someone whose body was beginning to consume itself for survival. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked, his official tone softening into something more human. "Yesterday," I lied, because admitting the truth would require energy I didn't have. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a $20 bill, holding it out to me with an awkwardness that spoke of good intentions constrained by departmental protocols. "There's an all-night diner on Colfax," he said. "They'll serve you." I stared at the money, understanding that accepting it would cement my transformation from citizen to charity case, but also understanding that pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. My fingers, when I reached for the bill, trembled so violently that I nearly dropped it. "Thank you," I whispered, and he nodded once before returning to his patrol car, leaving me alone with $20 and the knowledge that even strangers could see I was dying. But the diner on Colfax was a 20-minute walk, and 20 minutes might as well have been 20 miles given the state of my body. I tried to stand, and immediately felt the world tilt sideways, forcing me to sit back down hard on the bench. My legs, weakened by malnutrition and lack of proper rest, refused to support my weight for more than a few seconds at a time. I sat there holding that $20 bill, understanding with perfect clarity that I had reached the end of my resources. Not just financial resources, but physical and emotional reserves as well. This was what dying looked like. Not the dramatic death of movies and novels, but a quiet surrender to circumstances that had become larger than my ability to survive them. The eastern sky was beginning to show the faintest hint of dawn when I made what I thought might be my final decision. I would walk to St. Anthony's Church, the place where I had found brief moments of peace during these impossible days. If I was going to die, I wanted it to be in a place where someone had been kind to me, where the colored light through stained glass windows had reminded me that beauty still existed in the world. The journey to Bannock Street took me over an hour, with frequent stops to rest against building walls and lampposts. Each step required conscious effort, each block a negotiation with a body that wanted to simply stop moving. The $20 bill remained clutched in my fist, unspent because I lacked the strength to reach the diner. Evidence of how completely I had been defeated by my circumstances. The church was locked when I arrived, but there was a small alcove beside the main entrance where someone had placed a statue of the Virgin Mary. The alcove provided some shelter from the wind, and the statue, worn smooth by weather and years, seemed to offer a kind of companionship in that pre-dawn darkness. I settled on the concrete steps, my back against the wall, the $20 bill still in my hand like a talisman that had lost its power to protect me. My breathing was shallow and labored, and I could feel my heartbeat fluttering against my ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. This was surrender, complete and absolute, not the dramatic surrender of someone making a conscious choice, but the quiet surrender of a body that simply couldn't continue. As the sky lightened from black to deep gray, I closed my eyes and tried to remember prayers from my childhood. Not the formal liturgy of Sunday Mass, but the simple conversations with God that my mother had taught me before bedtime. "Now I lay me down to sleep," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if the words were spoken aloud or only thought. The morning sounds of the city were beginning. Distant traffic, the rumble of delivery trucks, the first birds greeting the dawn. Normal people were waking up in warm beds, planning their days, taking for granted the simple miracle of having someplace to go. I listened to these sounds of ordinary life continuing without me and felt a strange peace settling over my exhaustion. I had done my best. I had worked hard, raised my children, cared for my husband through his final illness, maintained my dignity as long as possible on the streets. If this was how my story ended, alone on the steps of a church with $20 I was too weak to spend, then at least it would end in a place where someone had shown me kindness. The sun was fully up when I felt my consciousness beginning to drift, not into sleep, but into something deeper and more permanent. My last coherent thought was a prayer of gratitude. For Robert, for my children, for Dorothy's friendship, for Officer Martinez's unexpected compassion, for the librarian's gentle kindness, even for the woman whose charity had stung my pride but fed my body. There had been grace in this difficult journey, even at its end. And then, in that moment between consciousness and whatever comes after, something impossible happened. When I opened my eyes, there was someone sitting beside me on the church steps. I hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't sensed movement, but suddenly I wasn't alone. The morning sun was streaming through the leaves of the maple tree that shaded the church entrance, and in that dappled light, I saw a man who seemed both completely ordinary and utterly extraordinary. He appeared to be about 40 years old, with dark hair touched by gray at the temples and eyes that held depths I couldn't fathom. His clothes were simple: jeans, a plain shirt, worn boots that looked like they had walked many miles. But there was something about his presence that filled the space around us with a warmth that had nothing to do with the Denver morning sun. My first instinct was fear. 3 days on the streets had taught me to be wary of strangers, especially men who approached vulnerable women. But when our eyes met, that fear dissolved instantly, replaced by a recognition so profound it seemed to resonate in my bones. I knew him, though I couldn't remember ever meeting him. I trusted him, though I had every reason to be suspicious. "Hello, Margaret," he said, and his voice was like water to someone dying of thirst, like coming home after years of wandering. No one had called me by my full name in days. I had become ma'am, or lady, or simply invisible to most people who passed by, but he spoke my name like it was precious, like it mattered. "I don't understand," I whispered, because nothing about this moment made sense. The $20 bill was still clutched in my hand, my body still weak with hunger and exhaustion. But something fundamental had shifted in the world around me. He smiled, and it was like watching the sunrise. "You've been carrying such a heavy burden," he said. "You don't have to carry it alone." I wanted to ask who he was, how he knew my name, why he wasn't afraid to sit beside a homeless woman who probably smelled of days without proper bathing. But the question seemed unimportant compared to the overwhelming sense of safety I felt in his presence. For the first time in days, maybe years, I felt completely seen, completely known, completely accepted. "I've made such a mess of everything," I said, though I hadn't intended to speak at all. The words came from some deep place inside me, from the part that had been breaking a little more each day since Robert's death, since the foreclosure, since that first night on the street. "You've done nothing wrong," he replied with such certainty that I almost believed him. "Life isn't a test you can fail, Margaret. It's a journey, and you're exactly where you need to be." On church steps, dying of hunger. The bitterness in my voice surprised me. Learning what can't be taken from you, he said gently. Learning that your worth isn't determined by your address, your bank account, or other people's opinions. Learning that love is stronger than loss. As he spoke, I felt something shifting inside my chest. Not healing exactly, but a loosening of knots I didn't even know I had been carrying. The shame that had been eating at me like acid began to dissolve, replaced by something I hadn't felt in so long I had forgotten its name. Belonging. I'm scared, I admitted, though I had been trying to hide my fear even from myself. I know, he said, and somehow that simple acknowledgement was more comforting than any reassurance could have been. But fear doesn't define you. Love defines you. The love you gave Robert through his illness. The love you poured into raising your children. The love you showed in every meal you prepared and every kindness you offered. That love doesn't disappear because your circumstances changed. The morning was growing warmer, and people were beginning to move through the neighborhood, commuters heading to bus stops, joggers starting their daily runs, shopkeepers opening their stores, but none of them seemed to notice us sitting on the church steps, as if we existed in a pocket of space and time that belonged only to this conversation. I keep thinking about the woman I used to be, I said, the one who had answers, who took care of everyone else, who knew her place in the world. I don't know how to be this person, lost and helpless and dependent on strangers. That woman is still inside you, he said. She's just learning new things. Sometimes we have to lose everything we thought we were to discover who we really are. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made my breath catch. A piece of fresh bread, still warm, with the kind of golden crust that spoke of careful baking and patient hands. The smell hit me like a physical force, awakening every cell in my starving body. Eat, he said. Placing the bread in my free hand, I tore off a piece and put it in my mouth, and it was like tasting food for the first time. Not just because I was hungry, though I was, but because this bread seemed to carry more than nutrition. It carried comfort, sustenance for parts of me I didn't even know were starving. Where did this come from? I asked, though I was already reaching for another piece. Does it matter? He replied, and something in his tone made me understand that some questions didn't need answers, only gratitude. As I ate, he began to tell me things about myself that no stranger should have known, about the lavender sachets I used to make for church fundraisers, about the way I hummed while cooking dinner, about the stories I told Tommy and Sarah when they were small and couldn't sleep during thunderstorms. He spoke about these memories with such tenderness that I began to see them differently, not as reminders of what I had lost, but as treasures I still carried. Your life isn't over, Margaret, he said as I finished the bread. It's changing into something new. Different doesn't mean less valuable. Sometimes the most important work we do happens when we have nothing left to prove. What kind of work could I possibly do now? I asked, gesturing to my torn cardigan, my dirty cast, my complete lack of resources. The work of showing others that dignity isn't dependent on circumstances, he said. The work of receiving help with grace so others can learn to give it. The work of remembering that every person you meet on these streets has a story as complex as yours. The sun had climbed higher while we talked, and I realized that hours must have passed, though it felt like minutes. The bread had given me strength I hadn't felt in days. But more than that, this conversation had given me something I had thought was gone forever. Hope. Will I see you again? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. He stood up from the church steps with a fluid grace that reminded me of dancers or athletes, people whose bodies obeyed their intentions perfectly. You'll see me, he said, but not in the way I expected. In every kindness shown, every hand extended, every moment when love proves stronger than fear. I'm always there, Margaret. You just have to remember how to look. He began to walk away, and I wanted to call after him, to ask his name, to beg him not to leave me alone again. But something told me that would be missing the point of everything he had tried to teach me. Instead, I watched him disappear around the corner of the church. And somehow I knew that although he was gone, he wasn't really gone at all. I sat there on the steps, holding the $20 bill in one hand and feeling the warmth of the bread in my belly, understanding that something fundamental had changed in my relationship with the world, The hunger was gone, but more than that, the despair was gone. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in days, I believed that something would happen, that my story wasn't over, but simply taking an unexpected turn. The transformation wasn't dramatic or magical in any outward way. I was still an elderly woman with a broken wrist and nowhere to live. But inside, where it mattered most, everything had shifted. I was no longer just surviving, I was preparing to discover what came next. The bread had given me strength enough to walk to the all-night diner Officer Martinez had mentioned, though by the time I arrived, it was nearly noon and the breakfast rush was long over. The Sunset Diner on Colfax was the kind of place that had been serving working-class Denver for decades. Vinyl booths patched with duct tape, a grill that had seen a million eggs, and a waitress named Betty who looked like she had been pouring coffee since the Reagan administration. Betty took one look at me, obviously homeless, obviously hungry, obviously not the kind of customer who would leave a generous tip, and did something that still amazes me when I think back on it. She smiled, not the professional smile of someone working for tips, but the genuine smile of someone who recognized need and chose to respond with kindness. "Honey, you look like you could use some feeding up," she said, leading me to a corner booth where I would be less conspicuous to other customers. "What sounds good to you?" I ordered the breakfast special, 2 eggs, bacon, hash browns, and toast, and when it arrived, I ate it slowly, savoring every bite. But more than the food, I savored Betty's casual dignity in serving me. She refilled my coffee without being asked, brought extra butter for my toast, and never once made me feel like charity. I was simply a customer in her diner, deserving of the same attention as anyone else. When I tried to pay with Officer Martinez's $20 bill, Betty waved it away. "That one's on the house, sweetheart, but you hold on to that money for later. You're going to need it." I wanted to argue, to insist on paying, but something in her tone told me that accepting her gift was as important to her as giving it. Sometimes grace requires us to receive as much as it requires others to give. "Why?" I asked, and she understood I wasn't just asking about the free meal. Because 30 years ago, I was sitting in a diner just like this one, broken, scared, and wondering what was going to happen to my kids, she said, wiping down the already clean table with practiced efficiency. A waitress named Dolores fed me that day and told me the same thing I'm telling you. It gets better, but only if you let people help. After the diner, I felt strong enough to walk to the main library branch, where I spent the afternoon in the periodical section, trying to look like I belonged while processing what had happened that morning. The encounter on the church steps felt both completely real and utterly impossible. I could still taste the bread, still feel the warmth of that presence beside me, but trying to explain it to myself in rational terms seemed futile. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of hallucination brought on by hunger and exhaustion? But if so, where had the bread come from? And why did I feel so fundamentally changed by what might have been nothing more than my mind's attempt to cope with despair? I decided it didn't matter. Real or imagined, the encounter had given me what I needed: hope, strength, and most importantly, a new way of seeing my circumstances. I was still homeless, still uncertain about my future, but I was no longer alone in the existential sense. The world, which had seemed indifferent to my suffering, had revealed itself to be full of people like Betty and Officer Martinez, individuals willing to extend kindness to strangers. That evening, I returned to Curtis Park and found that Dorothy had returned from the hospital. She was thinner than before, and her cough lingered, but her spirits were remarkably high for someone who had just spent 3 days in a charity ward. "Maggie," she called when she saw me approaching. "I was so worried about you. Carlos said you'd been looking for me." I told her about the past few days, the hunger, the fear, the encounter on the church steps, and she listened with the attention of someone who understood that stories of survival needed to be witnessed and honored. "Sounds like you met an angel," she said when I finished, and there was no skepticism in her voice, no suggestion that I had imagined anything. They show up when we need them most, usually looking like ordinary people. That night, Dorothy and I shared the $20 from Officer Martinez, buying sandwiches and hot soup from a convenience store, eating our dinner on the park bench while watching the sunset over downtown Denver. The food was simple, but it felt like a feast because it was shared, because it came from kindness, because it marked not just survival, but the beginning of something new. "I've been thinking," Dorothy said between spoonfuls of chicken noodle soup. "Maybe it's time I tried to get back on my feet. The social worker at the hospital said there might be a spot opening up at the transitional housing program." "That's wonderful," I said, and meant it, though the thought of losing my guide and companion frightened me. "What about you?" she asked. "What's your next step going to be?" I didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time since leaving the hospital, the question didn't fill me with panic. Something was going to happen. I could feel it building like weather on the horizon. The encounter that morning had convinced me that my story wasn't over, just changing direction in ways I couldn't yet see. The answer came the next morning in the form of Father Rodriguez, who found me sitting on the church steps where I had been the day before. He was older than I had realized when glimpsed from the back pews, probably in his 70s, with silver hair and the careful movements of someone managing arthritis. "You're Margaret, aren't you?" he said, settling beside me on the steps with a slight wince. "Betty from the Sunset Diner called me. She thought you could use some help." I was amazed that Betty had even known my name, let alone tracked down the priest of a church I had been quietly visiting. But I was learning that the community of people who serve Denver's most vulnerable was smaller and more connected than I had realized. "We don't have much," Father Rodriguez continued, "but we have a small apartment above the parish hall that we use for people in transition. It's not permanent, but it's safe and warm, and it would give you time to figure out your next steps." The offer was so unexpected, so perfectly timed, that I found myself speechless. A room of my own, a door that locked, a place where I could regain some measure of privacy and dignity. It seemed too good to be true. "I can't pay rent," I admitted. "We're not asking for rent," he said. "We're asking for help. Our regular janitor is going to be out for surgery for the next few months, and we need someone to keep the church clean, help with setup for events, maybe assist in the food pantry. It doesn't pay much, but it comes with housing and meals." I thought about my years of cleaning office buildings, about the pride I had once taken in leaving places better than I found them. Physical work was something I understood, something I could do even at 72 with a broken wrist that was finally beginning to heal. "When could I start?" I asked. Father Rodriguez smiled, and in that moment, I saw another kind of angel. Not the mysterious figure from the morning before, but the earthly kind who show up with practical solutions and steady kindness. "How about now?" he said. "Let's go take a look at your new home." As we walked around the church to the small apartment that would be mine for the next several months, I felt the last pieces of my old life finally falling away. I was no longer Margaret Thompson, the widow struggling to maintain her former identity. I was becoming someone new, a woman who had learned that grace often comes disguised as ordinary people doing extraordinary things, that angels walk among us wearing work boots and aprons, that home isn't a place you own, but a place where you're welcomed. The apartment was small but clean, with a kitchenette, a bathroom with a shower, and a window that looked out on the maple tree that shaded the church steps. As I stood in that simple room, holding the key Father Rodriguez had just handed me, I understood that this wasn't just housing. It was a chance to rebuild not just my circumstances, but my understanding of what it meant to belong in the world. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of St. Anthony's Parish Hall, preparing sandwiches for the weekly food distribution, my hands steady and my heart full of purpose I hadn't felt since Robert's illness consumed our final years together. The broken wrist had healed completely, leaving only a faint line of scar tissue as a reminder of my fall down those office building stairs that had started this journey. The work was exactly what I needed, physical enough to keep me healthy, meaningful enough to give me purpose, and flexible enough to allow me to heal at my own pace. I cleaned the church on weekday mornings, prepared food for the pantry in the afternoons, and helped coordinate volunteers for special events. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work, and it connected me to a community of people committed to caring for Denver's most vulnerable residents. Dorothy had successfully transitioned into permanent housing and found part-time work at a local nonprofit organization. We still met for coffee every Thursday morning, comparing notes on our respective journeys back from the margins of society. She had gained weight, her cough was gone, and her eyes held a spark of hope that hadn't been there during our nights in Curtis Park. "You look different," she observed during one of our Thursday meetings. "Not just healthier, though you definitely look healthier, but more settled. Like you've found your place." She was right. The desperate woman who had collapsed on church steps 6 months earlier had been replaced by someone calmer, more grounded, more aware of the intricate web of connections that hold communities together. I had learned to receive help gracefully, which in turn had taught me to give help more effectively than I ever had when I was secure and comfortable. My relationship with my children had also been transformed by my experience. When Sarah visited from Seattle in the spring, she expected to find her mother broken by what she saw as a series of tragic circumstances. Instead, she found someone who had been stripped down to essentials and rebuilt on a foundation of gratitude and purpose. "Mom, I feel terrible about not being able to help more when you lost the apartment," she said over dinner at a restaurant she insisted on paying for. "Don't," I told her, meaning it completely. What happened to me needed to happen. I just didn't know it at the time. I tried to explain about the encounter on the church steps, about the bread that had saved my life, about the strange peace that had settled over me when I finally stopped fighting my circumstances and started learning from them. Sarah listened with the patience of someone who loved me but didn't entirely understand, which was exactly the right response. Tommy called more frequently now, and our conversations had a depth they had lacked when I was simply his elderly mother, whose biggest problem was loneliness. Now I was someone who had faced genuine adversity and survived it, someone whose advice carried the weight of lived experience rather than just maternal concern. "I always knew you were strong, Mom," he said during one of our phone calls from his base in Colorado Springs. "But I didn't know you were this strong." The truth was, I hadn't known either. Strength, I was learning, wasn't something you possessed in advance of needing it. It was something you discovered in the process of enduring what seemed unendurable, something that emerged from the interaction between challenge and choice, between circumstances and character. The most surprising change was in my relationship with God. The formal prayers of my childhood had given way to something more conversational, more integrated into daily life. I found myself talking to God while I cleaned the church floors, while I prepared food for people who reminded me of who I had been 6 months earlier, while I watched the sunrise through my small apartment window. The mysterious figure from the church steps had never appeared again, at least not in the same form. But I saw him everywhere, in Betty's smile when she waved at me through the diner window, in Officer Martinez's concerned questions when he patrolled my neighborhood, in Father Rodriguez's patient guidance as I learned to navigate my new life, in the grateful faces of people who came to our food pantry. "I'm always there, Margaret. You just have to remember how to look," he had said. And now I understood what he meant. Grace wasn't a single dramatic intervention. It was a constant presence expressing itself through human kindness, through second chances, through the mysterious alchemy that transforms suffering into wisdom. One morning in late summer, I was setting up chairs in the parish hall for a community meeting when a young woman approached me. She was probably in her 30s, well-dressed, but obviously distressed, carrying herself with the careful control of someone trying not to fall apart in public. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for someone to talk to. I saw the sign about counseling services, but I'm not sure. I don't know if this is the right place." I recognized the look in her eyes immediately. It was the same desperate confusion I had seen in my own mirror during those first nights on the street. She was standing at the edge of her own precipice, looking down into uncertainty and trying to find the courage to ask for help. "It's exactly the right place," I assured her, gesturing to one of the chairs I had just arranged. "Sit down and tell me what's happening." Her story was different from mine in its details, but identical in its emotional architecture. A divorce that had left her financially devastated, a job loss that had exhausted her savings, a cascade of circumstances that had brought her to the brink of homelessness with 2 young children depending on her. As I listened, I realized that this was why I had survived my own fall, why I had been allowed to find my way back from the edge, not just to save myself, but to be present for others making the same terrifying journey. I had become a bridge between the comfortable world I had once inhabited and the precarious world I had learned to navigate, uniquely positioned to help others cross that dangerous territory. "It's going to be okay," I told her, And unlike 6 months ago when well-meaning strangers had said the same thing to me, I knew it was true because I had lived it. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to look like what you expected, but it's going to be okay. I spent the next hour connecting her with resources, making phone calls to people I had met through my work at the church, drawing on a network of relationships I couldn't have imagined when I was sitting alone on that park bench. By the time she left, she had appointments with social services, information about emergency housing assistance, and most importantly, the knowledge that she wasn't alone. That evening, as I prepared a simple dinner in my small kitchen, I found myself thinking about the bread from that morning on the church steps. It had been more than food. It had been a promise that sustenance would come, that help would arrive, that the story wasn't over even when it seemed like it was ending. Now I understood that I had become part of that promise for others. Every sandwich I prepared for the food pantry, every conversation with someone facing their own dark night of the soul, every small act of kindness I was able to offer because of what I had learned during my own journey, all of it was bread for the hungry, hope for the desperate, proof that grace is real and present and constantly at work in the world. As I sat down to eat, I offered the kind of prayer that had become natural to me, not a formal petition, but a conversation with a presence I now knew was always listening. "Thank you," I said simply, thinking of the young mother I had helped that day, of Dorothy's successful transition, of my own unlikely resurrection from despair. Thank you for the fall that taught me how to fly, for the hunger that taught me how to feast, for the darkness that showed me where the light lives. Outside my window, the maple tree that had sheltered my moment of transformation rustled in the evening breeze, and I could have sworn I heard an echo of that voice from 6 months ago. "I'm always there, Margaret. You just have to remember how to look." I was looking now, and I saw miracles everywhere. Dear listeners, we hope Margaret's story touched your heart. If you'd like to keep experiencing powerful stories like this, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Every day, we share stories that reveal the depth of life and the human heart. We'll be waiting for you in the comments.